Hey guys, tonight we're plunging headfirst into a world so full of stiff collars, stricter rules, and unwashed lace that you'll need a whole cup of chamomile just to cope. You blink open your eyes and it's 7 a.m. in Victorian England. Or, at least, what passes for 7 a.m. Because you don't have an alarm clock, just a knocker-upper outside your window, tapping with a long stick. You stir under a mound of heavy wool blankets, already regretting your life choices. A dim shaft of sunlight cuts through the soot-smudged curtains. It's cold, always cold. Your home has no insulation, and the fire's out. You push back the covers, and the chill hits you like a judgmental ant. You reach for your corset. That's right, whether you're a lady or an aspiring gentleman of society with peculiar fashion ideals, a corset's involved. For women, this is not just supported submission. Your ribs compress. You gasp. Lungs, optional. Spine, decorative. You need to lace it tight enough to faint fashionably by noon, preferably while clutching a fan and whispering something poetic. Over 50 pounds of layered skirts, petticoats, chemises, and bonnets await. And you're not even out of the bedroom yet. For children, the day starts even earlier, especially if you're the unfortunate soul known as a climbing boy. That's right, your job is to shimmy up narrow chimneys that haven't seen the sky in decades, covered in soot, crawling through claustrophobic tunnels, and inhaling creosote. For breakfast it's character building. Apparently, boys as young as 4 were forced into this job, rubbed down with salt and urine afterward, true story, and told they were lucky to be working. Victorian logic is as airtight as those chimneys. Meanwhile, you still corseted descend the narrow stairs of your home, careful not to trip on your own skirts. You pass by the parlor, where the walls are covered in wallpaper that might just contain arsenic. Victorian wallpaper was beautiful and sometimes toxic, much like the people your breakfast don't. Get excited. Porridge, weak tea, maybe some toast if you're a rebel. Eggs and bacon are reserved for the rich or those with a fondness for gout. You sip slowly, remembering not to slurp, speak, or God forbid tilt your spoon the wrong way. You eat in silence, unless you're among close family, in which case you may discuss lightly topics like the weather or Queen Victoria's latest sigh. The house is drafty and creaks with judgment. You hear the clang of pots in the scullery. You're fortunate enough to have servants. They've been up since 5 a.m., hauling coal, scrubbing chamber pots, and washing yesterday's mistakes. If not, that's your job too. Bathing is optional and frowned upon more than twice a week, so you stick to your vinegar rub-downs and powdered perfumes. Speaking of smells, you're already used to the pervasive scent of coal smoke, wet wool, and horse dung wafting from the streets outside. And if you thought the outside air would be fresher, think again. It's foggy with soot and sulfur. Nicknamed pea soupers, congratulations. You now live in a lung hazard. Now the chimney sweep boy is back, blackened with soot and a haunting stare. Haze coughing constantly, and no one's surprised, because sweep's cancer is a known fate. Historians still argue whether society at large genuinely cared or just saw it as an unfortunate byproduct of domestic comfort. But you shrug. It's Victorian England. Children are miniature adults, and suffering is a virtue. You open the newspaper to distract yourself, except it's more like a moral guideline. Advertisements for corsets that guarantee perfect posture share space with cures for hysteria. involving questionable devices and even more questionable doctors. You frown, but your eyebrows are too stiff from soap and starch to fully express disapproval. Looking out the window, you see the street come alive, flower sellers shouting, "Where's the lamplighter?" extinguishing gas lamps one by one, a dustman collecting the ashes from yesterday's fires, and a meat cart hauling what may or may not be horse meat. You pull on gloves because bare hands are scandalous and prepare to step outside. Just before you do, you check your appearance in the hall mirror, making sure your skirt hem isn't too high. Anything above the ankle is practically a striptease, and that your bonnet covers enough of your hair to make it clear you are, indeed, a person of virtue. Hair, by the way, must be elaborately twisted, pinned, and lacquered into submission. Stray locks are moral failures. Once you're out, the streets are an orchestral mess of clopping hooves, rattling carts, shouting vendors, and that ever-present stench of horse manure mingling with chimney smoke and wet brick. You keep your eyes down, lest you make accidental eye contact with a stranger, which could be construed as flirtation or madness, depending on your gender. You make your way toward the market, where vegetables are dirt-covered and fruit is seasonal, meaning you'll need to haggle politely in your best bonnet voice for a decent deal on potatoes. That's the Victorian daily grind. Restrict, repress, repeat. Even the pigeons look repressed. You overhear a woman discussing her neighbor's daughter's refusal to wear mourning black after her cousin's death. Scandalous. Grief is scheduled in your calendar. Mourning is a public performance. Back at home, the chimney sweep boy returns one last time. He's clearly unwell. A cough deeper than the wells of Wuthering Heights. He'll likely not make it past 20. But you, still wrapped in 15 pounds of propriety and linen, sigh and carry on with your corseted day. You pour a second cup of weak tea and feel your stomach twinge. It's hungry, but it'll wait. Victorian breakfast was never about nourishment. It was about appearances and the routine of suffering that comes with being civilized. As you sit by the window, the soot-streaked light filtering through, you realize your day hasn't even truly started. There's still a strict etiquette to lunch, a visit to make, and a reputation to maintain. But that's for later. For now, you adjust your corset against it this time. It's only 9 a.m. and you're already exhausted. You rest your head against the cool glass and watch the fog roll in again, thick as regret. This is life in Victorian England, and somehow you're expected to thrive in it. You shuffle toward the dining room, careful not to scuff your boots or let the hem of your skirt brush the floor too intimately. After all, floors are for servants, not respectable fabric. The table is already set with a miniature army of utensils. Forks for fish, forks for salad, forks for meat, forks for simply demonstrating that you own too many forks. You stare at the cutlery, and the cutlery stares back. You take your place with military precision, unfolding your napkin in exactly 3 folds, not too neatly, lest you appear vain, and not too casually, lest you appear indifferent. You sit at the edge of the chair, upright and stiff like someone who swallowed a broom. A maid brings in the soup. You must tilt the spoon away from you while sipping, never slurping, never blowing, and absolutely never making eye contact with the soup. That's considered forward. The peas arrive next. They mock you. You are expected to mash them gently against the back of your fork and coax them into your mouth 1 or 2 at a time. Stabbing peas is barbaric, and you are not a barbarian. You are a refined Victorian citizen with a tortured digestive tract and a social reputation. Every move is a performance. You can't begin eating until the hostess lifts her spoon. You can't butter bread with the dinner knife. You can't leave the spoon in the teacup. You can't talk with food in your mouth. You can't cut salad. You can't reach across the table. You can't do anything remotely human. If someone sneezes, you do not say "bless you." You pretend it didn't happen. A sneeze is too bodily, too organic, too real. Victorian dinner etiquette isn't just about manners. It's about control. Even chewing must be silent. There's a strict cadence to the meal. Soup first, then fish, then meat, then poultry, then pudding, then cheese, then fruit. God forbid you get the order wrong. God forbid you reach for the salt without being asked. The salt, by the way, is in an ornate silver cellar, and you must use the designated salt spoon to transfer a pinch to your plate. Licking your fingers afterward is punishable by social death. Meanwhile, conversation is carefully monitored. You may discuss whether art, the Queen's latest public appearance, or the health of someone's second cousin. Never politics, never religion, never bodily functions, never feelings. Just topics as starched and bland as the food itself. Speaking of which, the meat is dry. It's always dry. Roasted until the last molecule of joy has been extracted. The vegetables are boiled to oblivion. The potatoes are as cold as your inner emotions. And still, you smile. Still, you nod. Still, you say quite, and indeed, and oh, I do agree, every 6 minutes, like a conversational metronome. And if you're a woman, your job isn't to eat. Your job is to appear as though you're eating while simultaneously keeping your waist singed and your posture rigid. If you actually enjoy the food, you must hide that shame deep within your corset. You glance across the table and see someone committing the ultimate faux pas, using the fish knife on the mutton. You gasp internally. Outwardly, you sip your water as if nothing happened. But this will be discussed in hushed whispers later, possibly in the drawing room, definitely in the weekly letter to your cousin. And now it's time for pudding, which, ironically, may not be sweet. Pudding is a catch-all term that includes everything from gelatinous meat pies to cold beige mysteries covered in suet. You push it around your plate, hoping no one asks your opinion on it. Then comes cheese, served with yet another knife you're meant to identify without guidance. And finally, fruit. You don't peel the apple. The servant does, with a silver fruit knife. And if you do it yourself, you must peel in a continuous ribbon, letting it coil in your palm like a badge of discipline. Some guests may be sipping claret or port, but you're barely holding back your sigh. You long for simplicity, a sandwich, a carrot, something you can bite without causing a scandal. But alas, this is not dinner. This is warfare in crinoline. Even exiting the table requires choreography. You don't stand until the hostess does. You fold your napkin loosely, not tightly, lest it implies you disliked the meal. Then you process slowly to the drawing room, where you pretend to enjoy conversation about needlepoint and Mr. Whistlebottom's latest poetry reading. Historians still argue whether the rigidity of Victorian table etiquette was about refinement or just a way to keep everyone too distracted by forks to start revolutions. Either way, it worked. Your stomach hurts, your neck aches, and you haven't even had dessert. Dessert, by the way, may involve something called a tipsy cake, soaked in alcohol and regret, or blancmange, wobbly, trembling, milk-based delicacy that looks and tastes like a failed science experiment. You're meant to enjoy it with a small spoon and smaller conversation. By now, you've memorized the layout of every utensil, every conversational landmine, and every social expectation. You're exhausted, but the evening isn't over yet. There may be cards, or music, or worse, charades. You're expected to perform. You can't just exist. You must entertain. You must sing, play, recite, preferably without revealing too much talent, because that would be uncouth. You see someone bite into a peach with their teeth raw. No knife, no ceremony. An audible gasp passes through the room. Eyes widen. A fan is dropped. Someone excuses themselves. That person will not be invited back. Meanwhile, you sit with your teacup, pinky lowered raising. It is actually a myth, by the way, and nod politely. Your tea is lukewarm, flavored faintly with bergamot and shame. You're not sure whether to cry or applaud your own endurance. And somewhere in the distance, you hear a footman sneeze and pretend not to. This is etiquette. This is elegance. This is suffering dressed in lace. Every bite is choreographed. Every gesture scrutinized. Every plate, fork, knife, and spoon whispers judgment. And you survive it. Somehow, even though deep down, you know that if someone handed you a napkinless sandwich right now, you would devour it like a street urchin. But for now, you just smile, because you are a creature of etiquette, a being of ceremony, a fork-wielding performance artist in a corseted shell. You barely recover from the trauma of Victorian table manners when yet another social minefield rears its veil-covered head. Mourning. Someone has died: an aunt, a cousin, a monarch, a neighbor you nodded to once in 1847, and now you are plunged headfirst into the murky, lace-draped ocean of Victorian grief protocol. There is no quick sigh and a card of condolences here. There is a schedule, a fabric hierarchy, a color palette, and a tone of voice you must maintain at all costs. The moment the death is confirmed, your wardrobe undergoes a dramatic transformation. Black becomes your new religion. Jet black dresses, black gloves, black handkerchiefs, black hats with black veils that hang just long enough to obscure your face and make walking a mild hazard. You are not just expressing sorrow, you are performing it, living it, wearing it until your skin itches from crepe and your soul smells faintly of mildew. You must wear black for 2 full years if the deceased was close parents, spouses, children. If the dearly departed was less intimate, like a cousin's ex-husband's niece, you might get away with 6 months of half-mourning, a phase where you are allowed to wear shades of gray, lilac, or deep purple, but only if your accessories remain firmly black. And yes, even your jewelry mourns. Jet beads, made from fossilized coal, become your only allowable ornament. Pearls are permitted only to symbolize tears, though it's best not to wear them unless you've cried at least once. Everything else, gold, silver, sapphires, even modest brooches, shelved until you rejoin the land of the emotionally available. Even the handkerchiefs must play their part, trimmed with black lace, initialed in mourning script, and preferably scented with something melancholic like lavender or cloves. You carry them everywhere, even if you have no intention of crying. Crying in public, while sometimes encouraged, must never be ugly or loud. A single tear rolling slowly down a powdered cheek is ideal. Historians still argue whether this elaborate mourning code truly honored the dead or simply served as a tool for social policing. But in the moment, you have no time to question. You are too busy making sure your veil doesn't snag on the garden gate. During mourning, you withdraw from society, not because you want to, but because you're required to. No parties, no concerts, no visiting friends for a casual laugh. Laughter is illegal in grief. If someone tells a joke, you must demurely lower your eyes and whisper, "How very inappropriate." If you're caught smiling during full mourning, people will talk, and not in a kind way. They'll whisper that you never truly loved the deceased, that you were relieved, that perhaps you even nudged the timeline along. Victorians had an insatiable appetite for scandal, especially the funereal kind. If you're a widow, things get even more complicated. You must wear widow's weeds, a particularly depressing ensemble of matte black fabric, so stiff and dull it absorbs light. No sheen, no shimmer, just sorrow woven into every fiber. Your head is covered at all times, and your only outings are to church or the cemetery. You do not remarry within 2 years, unless you want to be branded as unfeeling or fast, which is Victorian for mildly human. If you are male, your mourning is less constricting. A black armband may suffice. A black cravat if you're feeling especially bereaved. You get to continue your social life with minimal interruption, because apparently men grieve in more efficient time frames. A woman may be expected to mourn a brother longer than a man is expected to mourn his wife. Fairness was not invited to this particular funeral. Even your home must mourn. Mirrors are draped in black cloth to prevent the spirit of the deceased from being trapped inside. And because nobody should see their reflection during mourning, it's seen as vain and emotionally distasteful. Clocks are stopped at the time of death, symbolizing the end of that person's time. Sometimes, family portraits are turned around to face the wall, as if the very memory of joy is too painful to look at. Black crepe ribbons are tied to doorknobs, hat stands, and even the family pet if it's particularly obedient. Funerals are not private affairs, they're theatrical productions. Invitations are printed, mourning carriages are hired, and professional mourners can be brought in if the crowd isn't sufficiently somber. These hired criers weep on cue, sob gracefully, and even faint at appropriate intervals. You may also need to arrange for a mourning photographer to capture the moment. Post-mortem photography is all the rage. The dead are posed to appear alive sometimes, seated in chairs, sometimes propped up with hidden stands, sometimes with eyes painted on closed eyelids. If it sounds ghoulish, it is. But it's also considered the final portrait, the last chance to immortalize a loved one's features before decay does its impolite work. You may even be asked to sit beside them in the photo, your living grief juxtaposed with their stillness. Smile, but not too much. The cemetery is not a sad place. In Victorian England, it's practically a public park. Families picnic on graves, stroll among tombstones, and treat it like a botanical garden with extra ambience. You might spot someone brushing lichen off a headstone while sipping tea, or laying flowers while discussing the weather. Death is everywhere, but sanitized, stylized, ritualized, until it's more fashion than fear. Victorians didn't just grieve, they built an entire industry around it. Mourning warehouses existed to sell every conceivable death-related item. Gloves, veils, stationery, mourning fans, funeral, china, even black-bordered calling cards. You couldn't just announce a death, you had to mail it on the correct cardstock, sealed with black wax, delivered by a gloved hand, ideally accompanied by a pressed violet and the scent of bitter almonds. Children were not exempt from mourning customs. Tiny black frocks and miniature veils were made for young girls, and boys wore scaled-down suits of sorrow. If a child died in, many did the mourning shifted into high gear. Locks of hair were clipped and braided into jewelry, woven into wreaths, framed and hung in parlors like sacred relics. Mourning dolls were crafted in their likeness. Rooms were sometimes preserved exactly as they were, beds unmade, toys left in place, as if time could be tricked into rewinding. Meanwhile, you keep to your schedule, the calendar of grief. 6 months of deep mourning, then 6 months of second mourning, then gradual re-entry into society through half mourning, like a polite resurrection. When you're finally allowed to wear lavender, it feels like springtime in fabric form, but even then, you tread carefully. Too much color too soon, and people will assume your grief was performative. Too little, and they'll call you morbid. You can't win, but you must participate. That's the Victorian way. You wonder sometimes if all this effort is truly for the dead door, just to keep the living busy, distracted, under control, a way to assign rules to chaos. Historians still argue whether Victorian mourning culture reflected a deep-seated reverence for the afterlife or merely a societal obsession with appearances. But in your corseted haze of sorrow, the debate feels irrelevant. You do what is expected. You don't ask why, because grief here isn't about feeling, it's about performing. And you've been rehearsing your lines since birth. It's early morning again, and you find yourself standing at the edge of a tin basin filled with lukewarm water and dread. The idea of submerging your whole body into a tub is out of the question. Bathing is viewed with suspicion, a risky practice that could throw off your internal humors and leave you vulnerable to illness, insanity, or worse, relaxation. Instead, you embrace the ritual of the sponge bath. More accurately, a damp cloth dipped into vinegar or rose water, passed across the neck and wrists with great reluctance and absolutely no splashing. Your goal is not to be clean in any modern sense, but to be socially acceptable, odor neutral at best, though olfactory neutrality is rare. When you've been sleeping in layers of wool blankets next to a coal fire and under a damp ceiling for the better part of a night, you reach for your underclothes, not fresh from a drawer, but aired out overnight on a rack near the hearth. Laundry is too laborious to be done often, so items are recycled in creative ways, often with liberal doses of lavender, sachets, camphor, and powdered starch. If you're especially lucky or particularly ripe, you might dab yourself with toilet vinegar, an astringent made of herbs steeped in acidic wine. It stings slightly and smells like a garden funeral, but at least it doesn't advertise your sweat the way unperfumed skin does. Deodorant, as you know it, doesn't exist. Instead, people use chalk, crushed orris root, and occasionally a concoction of lead and alum to close the pores, which sounds safe until your armpits turn a peculiar shade of regret. There's also the option of perfume pads, little spongy rectangles soaked in heavy scent and tucked under the arms, sewn into bodices, or even inserted into hats. The effect is a human potpourri, a walking collision of musk, florals, and desperation. Historians still argue Whether Victorians were truly more odorous than other eras, or simply more obsessed with hiding the evidence of their humanity. But you don't have time to ponder as you lace up your corset and try not to black out. The idea of a full bath, the kind involving actual immersion, is rare and reserved for the wealthy or dangerously unwell. Even then, it is approached with the caution usually reserved for bear attacks or moral compromise. You might draw a bath once a month, maybe every few weeks if you're especially modern, but only under strict protocol. Water not too hot, not too cold, and never above the heart. Overheating the body is believed to weaken the nerves and provoke fits. Cold water, on the other hand, is thought to toughen the character and inspire good posture. But too cold, and you'll be accused of inviting rheumatism into your bones. And since indoor plumbing is not a common luxury, baths are often a logistical nightmare involving several servants, buckets of heated water, and a complicated system of screens to preserve your modesty, while simultaneously leaving you half naked in a tin coffin of discomfort. For many, cleanliness is achieved by rotation washing one part of the body each day, like a calendar of hygiene. Monday, feet; Tuesday, hands; Wednesday, face; Thursday, neck and chest; Friday, shameful regions; Saturday, hair, maybe, if the stars align. Speaking of hair, washing it is a monumental undertaking. For women with long locks, it's a 3-day event. You start by brushing it with stiff boar bristles, then applying egg yolk, lye soap, or if you're daring, kerosene for shine. Then rinse with beer or rainwater and allow it to dry naturally while pinned around the head like a halo of damp regrets. It smells fermented. But again, better that than the scent of actual human. For men, hair is pomaded into submission, slicked with bear grease or macassar oil until it gleams like polished boots. And if you're wondering how this affects furniture, wonder no more. Antimacassars, those frilly white doilies draped over chairs, are not decorative, they're protective. They're the final defense between upholstery and scalp grease. And don't even think about using soap freely. Soap is expensive, often caustic, and available in limited varieties. Some soaps contain arsenic for whitening purposes. Others include lard, soda ash, and questionable minerals that make you reconsider the entire concept of cleanliness. Your teeth, you clean them with crushed chalk, burnt bread crumbs, or a vinegar rinse so acidic it peels enamel like paint. Toothbrushes are made with bone and pig bristle, and flossing is not a thing. You might use a feather quill if something gets truly stuck. Some people swish brandy or clove water, more for scent than sanitation. Tooth decay is common. Gums bleed often, but as long as your breath smells vaguely of mint and lies, you're considered presentable. The obsession with scent extends to the home as well. Potpourri bowls are placed in every room. Oranges stuffed with cloves hang from ceiling beams. Vinegar-soaked cloths are waved in front of the face during walks, especially if one must pass a fishmonger or a particularly emotional beggar. You never really breathe air. You breathe through layers of scent, etiquette, and anxiety. Even your letters carry fragrance. Scented paper is considered fashionable, though controversial. A rose-scented note might suggest romantic interest, while a lavender one implies mourning. A letter that smells like jasmine and ambition might ruin a family's reputation if it falls into the wrong hands. And because paper is expensive, some households reuse it, scraping off old ink and writing over faint ghost letters, creating scented palimpsests of polite deception. If you fall ill-and you will the cure may involve mustard plasters, leeches, or bleeding, and you will not bathe. Cleanliness is seen as weakening during illness. A sick room must smell of camphor, vinegar, and resignation. Sheets are changed rarely. Air is considered dangerous. Windows stay shut. You stew in your own sweat and hope for divine intervention. Doctors recommend a dry diet for fevers. No water, just broths and sips of wine. You may also be prescribed a brisk walk in the rain to revive the spirits. If that fails, your physician may administer a tonic of mercury, opium, and sugar. The mercury ruins your teeth, the opium steals your dreams, and the sugar makes it palatable enough to swallow. You begin to question whether the cure is more polite than the disease. And yet, with all these restrictions, people still try to appear fresh. They pinch their cheeks, bite their lips to induce color, and rub belladonna into their eyes to make the pupils dilate, because wide pupils are considered sensual. Never mind that belladonna is toxic and can cause permanent blindness. Beauty is suffering, and hygiene is performance. Historians still argue whether these practices were signs of cultural restraint or simply the logical outcome of a society obsessed with appearances over comfort. But in this moment, standing in your stiff collar and sweat-masking scent cloud, you lean toward the latter. You step outside, finally, into the open air, which smells marginally better than your bedroom. The streets are still grimy. The gutters still run with dubious fluids, but at least the breeze gives you hope. You pass a butcher whose apron defies the concept of cleanliness, a fish seller whose breath could strip wallpaper, and a flower girl doused in rose water. You inhale deeply and realize that among the stench and soot, there's a strange kind of pride everyone here is managing, surviving, pretending, just like you. A little more vinegar, a little more powder, and you too can pass for genteel. Even if your socks haven't been washed in 3 weeks and your underarms smell like roasted regret. Because in Victorian England, cleanliness isn't next to godliness, it's next to impossibility. You've now mastered the delicate art of scrubbing your armpits with vinegar, eating peas one at a time, mourning your goldfish with jet black gloves. And still your trials are far from over, because in Victorian England, even words can betray you. You open your mouth to speak, and suddenly must weigh every syllable like it's gunpowder. You can't say leg, you just can't. Not at dinner, not in the parlor, not even when describing the anatomy of a table. You say limb, or, preferably, nothing at all, merely gesturing in the general direction of the forbidden appendage like it's Voldemort. Trousers is similarly suspect. It's too vivid, too suggestive, too ... leg adjacent. You refer instead to inexpressibles or unmentionables, which, ironically, only draw more attention. There are entire books on how not to speak, and you carry one mentally like an invisible Bible of self-censorship. The word pregnant is unutterable. A woman is said to be in a delicate condition, expecting or with child, as though she were a parcel from the royal mail, cautiously on its way. Even the act of childbirth itself is hidden beneath layers of lace and euphemism. Women confining themselves to bed can mean anything from having a cold to actively producing a human. Nobody discusses the process. They merely nod gravely and say she's indisposed, while servants pass one another knowing glances and whisper around corners. If you're writing a letter and need to refer to anything remotely physical, You may find yourself buried under a thesaurus of ridiculousness. Even underclothes or renamed drawers become foundation garments. Corsets are stays, and nightgowns are bed linens. This lexical laundering extends to furniture. Legs of pianos and chairs are covered with modesty sleeves, so they don't provoke scandal. Historians still argue whether this obsession with sanitized vocabulary reflected genuine moral panic or a collective cultural performance of repression. But you suspect both, especially when overhearing someone describe a chicken's drumstick as a lower joint. Children, of course, absorb this linguistic gymnastics early on. Little girls are corrected for saying belly. They must say stomach or, better yet, abdomen, though no one should be discussing body parts. Unless they're a physician or a mortician, boys may be scolded for any phrase hinting at bodily functions, and the word toilet is tiptoed around with almost religious awe. It becomes lavatory, water closet, or the necessary. To say the actual thing you're doing there, absolutely unthinkable. You hold it both literally and verbally. You find yourself speaking in riddles just to make it through the day. If someone asks how you are, you cannot say tired, as that implies physical limits. You say a little fatigued, or slightly out of sorts. You don't admit to having a headache. You say you're suffering from a nervous disposition. Even illness must be refined. A woman isn't hysterical, though she might be sent to a spa with padded walls and no windows to cure her tendency toward melancholia. Men are overworked or affected by strain, a convenient diagnosis for everything from gout to existential despair. Your conversations become layered with innuendo, not because you want to be cheeky, but because anything direct sounds obscene. You once said the word pants at a gathering, and the room fell so silent you could hear the scandal congeal. You now say trousers if absolutely necessary, or just never mention them at all. It's safer that way. Literature, too, is sanitized. If a book contains anything even slightly suggestive, it may be published anonymously, with certain passages removed or reworded by editors keen to protect the reader's moral fiber. Entire novels are banned for describing a kiss that lasts more than 2 sentences. Poets must cloak their longing in metaphor storms, roses, nightingales, and heat. Even the act of courtship is bound in a cocoon of oblique gestures. A woman dropping her glove is an act of social daring. A man retrieving it without looking directly at her is practically a proposal. If he dares compliment her appearance, it must be about her elegant bearing or refined expression, never her actual face, or heaven forbid her limbs. Some families use code systems for romantic correspondence, like the language of flowers or folding a handkerchief in specific patterns to signal everything from "I adore you" to "go away, you scandalous beast." One misplaced dahlia and your reputation might implode. Even in the theater, censorship reigns supreme. The Lord Chamberlain's office must approve every script, and actors learn to speak in layers. What they say, what they mean, and what the audience is allowed to guess. You might attend a play with 5 different understandings, depending on your age, gender, and moral calibration. Punchlines are often whispered or lost behind exaggerated stage coughs. You laugh anyway. Everyone does. It's the only safe response. And of course, language policing doesn't stop at spoken words. It seeps into how you write. Diaries are censored by their own authors, carefully worded in case someone finds them. Letters are proofread for moral ambiguity. Even grocery lists might avoid the word rump or breast when referring to cuts of meat, for fear of drawing a servant's smirk. You begin to doubt your own tongue. Is it safe to say under the weather? Is it too bodily to say you're sore? You invent new phrases just to be safe, in feeling less than ideal. My constitution is in need of adjustment. Today is moderate. You teach children not to name things, but to dance around them. You praise a girl for being graceful instead of pretty, and a boy for being forthright instead of handsome. Adjectives become loaded weapons. Compliments are dangerous. A glance, if held too long, becomes a statement you didn't mean to make. And yet, despite all this delicacy, Victorian slang thrives in the back alleys. The working classes, the sailors, the cabbies, and the costermongers develop a whole parallel universe of language. Bold, crude, and alive. To give someone the glad eye is to flirt. To kick the bucket is to die. A nosebagger is someone who attends events uninvited for free food. The contrast is dizzying. You move from parlor to market and feel like you've traveled continents. The upper classes fear this language, fear its earthiness, its proximity to reality. They cling harder to euphemism, as if it will protect them from the truth that bodies exist, that they make sounds and smells, and sometimes embarrassing decisions. Even servants are expected to use a kind of refined speech when addressing their employers, one that avoids direct reference to anything that might imply physicality, emotion, or financial distress. You don't say we're out of soap. You say the stores of cleansing provision appear to have diminished. You don't say the child wet the bed. You say there was an unfortunate nocturnal disturbance. The more syllables, the safer it sounds. Meanwhile, medical professionals try to navigate this terrain with increasingly elaborate jargon. What once was called worms becomes intestinal parasitic condition. Madness becomes nervous exhaustion. The language distances everyone from the problem until no one knows what they're treating. You once heard a doctor say, the lady is experiencing palpitations of a psychosomatic origin associated with feminine fragility. Translation: she's anxious and her corset is too tight, but no one dares say so. And yet, despite all the verbal acrobatics, the system is self-enforcing. You correct yourself before others can. You see a chair leg and call it a supporting extension. You see a woman visibly pregnant and refer to her impending joyous complication. You write a note about a rash and say cutaneous unease. You lose all sense of linguistic proportion. Even your dreams are narrated in whispers and ellipses. Historians still argue whether this Victorian war on language was a genuine attempt at moral elevation or a giant national inside joke that went on for too long. But the truth lies somewhere in between. By avoiding direct speech, people avoided direct confrontation. And in a world held together by fabric, fear, and fan gestures, sometimes silence or, at least elegantly, reworded avoidance was the only thing standing between you and social ruin. You've grown accustomed to your own smell, masked by lavender vinegar, mastered the spoken contortions of calling chair legs. Supports in pregnant women, expectant. But nothing quite prepares you for the elaborate universe of animal etiquette in Victorian life, where pets are dressed more elegantly than servants' horses mourn, like widowed aunts, and a dog's hat can make or break your entire social standing. You begin your morning stroll gloved, veiled, and corseted, and it's not long before you encounter a Pomeranian in a lace. bonnet being pushed in a wicker prong, its owner oblivious to the absurdity of treating a yappy dust mop like a visiting duke. This is entirely normal. In fact, it's expected. Small dogs, lap dogs, preferably French and expensive, are not just pets. They are accessories, symbols of refinement, and repositories of affection that cannot be publicly directed at humans. Due to the emotionally constipated etiquette of the era, you are not allowed to say, "I love you," to your spouse without sounding like a foreigner, but you may knit an entire wardrobe for your terrier and host a birthday tea in its honor with no raised eyebrows. Queen Victoria herself set the tone by doting on her beloved dogs, breeding them with obsessive passion, and even commissioning elaborate paintings of them. Naturally, the public followed suit, and so now you live in a world where you might overhear someone scolding their spaniel in iambic pentameter or referring to their greyhound as Lady Beatrice. These animals have names longer than most people's lives and wardrobes deeper than your closet. Velvet jackets, monogrammed collars, custom-stitched booties for rainy strolls. The pets have arrived, and they are judging you. You are expected to acknowledge them, perhaps even compliment them, but never touch without permission. And if your dog is of a working breed or, heaven forbid, muddy, you best keep it out of sight, unless you wish to be mistaken for a chimney sweep who stole a pet on the way to work. But dogs are just a beginning. Cats, though less fashionable in the early Victorian era due to lingering superstitions, make a comeback thanks to their utility in mousing and their increasing aesthetic appeal. They're often named things like Lord Puddlington or Mistress Whiskafluff, and are photographed in seated poses that suggest deep melancholy or unresolved inheritance disputes. You pass a shop window and see a cat seated on a velvet cushion next to a gilded dish of cream, staring into the void like it owes no one anything, and truly, it doesn't. Birds are also popular, especially canaries and parrots, housed in ornate cages that hang from parlor ceilings like chandeliers with personality. Their chirping is a sign of domestic bliss, and their silence a social warning. A dead bird in a drawing room could derail an entire afternoon. Children are taught to speak softly around them, lest their delicate constitutions be offended. You might find yourself apologizing to a parrot for using a tone that hinted at sarcasm. Then there are the more eccentric choices. Some aristocrats keep hedgehogs as conversation pieces, dressed in ribbons and trained to roll into fashionable hats. Monkeys, imported from colonies with zero ethical consideration, are paraded at garden parties until they bite someone's finger or throw something scandalous at a governess. Tortoises are kept in conservatories as mobile furniture. Even ferrets have a brief moment of stardom, used to chase rabbits out of manicured lawns, sometimes ending up in parlor photos with ruffled collars around their tiny throats. Historians still argue whether this explosion of pet culture was an extension of the Victorian obsession with hierarchy extending status and etiquette even to animals, or whether it was simply a byproduct of loneliness in a society too rigid for real intimacy. Either way, the animals thrived, and so did their accessories. You visit a pet emporium and are confronted with aisles of bespoke leashes, miniature chaise, lounges for dogs, and bird swings carved from mahogany. One section even offers mourning attire for animals whose human companions have pastinny black capes for cats, crepe armbands for parrots, and if you're truly committed, a full set of veiled harnesses for your pony. Yes, ponies have feelings too, and they must be dressed accordingly. If your family is in mourning, your horse must wear a black plume on its head. Your carriage must be draped in somber fabrics. Your dog must not be seen frolicking. It's not just about how you grieve, it's about how your animals perform grief. A joyful bark during a funeral procession could earn you a permanent place on society's blacklist. But animal etiquette doesn't just apply to pets. Working animals, horses, carriage dogs, even messenger pigeons are held to strict codes. A coachman who fails to braid his horse's mane properly is considered slovenly. A baker's cat seen sleeping on flour sacks might cause a boycott. You've heard of a laundress losing clients because her goat wandered too close to a customer's umbrella. It's not just cleanliness, it's reputation, and your animals are part of it, whether they like it or not. Horses especially are under constant surveillance. A well-bred lady's carriage horse must be sleek, docile, and unoffensive in smell. If your horse snorts too loudly, spooks at a hat, or relieves itself in front of a church, you might never be invited to the bishop's garden party again. The stables themselves must be kept in order, with decorative harnesses and brass fittings polished to a blinding gleam. You once spent 2 hours grooming a horse's fetlocks because the vicar was known to judge equine cleanliness with the same vigor he judged sin. And while all this sounds absurd, you understand its purpose. In a society where even your sleeve buttons are coded with class signals, your animals become an extension of your identity. A pampered spaniel means leisure and wealth. A lean mutt with one ear, poverty. A cat that begs, ungodly. A parrot that curses, catastrophic. You've known people to be disinvited from entire seasons of social gatherings because their parrot repeated something the butler said about the master's gout. Birds are gossip with wings. Even funerals involve animals. It's customary for the family dog to attend the graveside, properly leashed and dressed in black if possible. There are stories, probably apocryphal, of cats leaping into graves, of horses refusing to move after their owner's death, of canaries falling silent in solidarity. You're never quite sure what's true and what's sentimental fluff, but it doesn't matter. The belief is real, and that makes it matter. You once visited a woman who wore a brooch containing the fur of a deceased bulldog and kept its collar in a velvet box beside her bed. The dog had its own obituary. You wrote it. You didn't have a choice. It was that, or be considered heartless. And so you continue. You nod to the spaniel in his tartan waistcoat. You tip your bonnet to the cat in the window. You hold your breath as a pair of mourning horses pass by, their heads bowed, their plumes trailing like ink. Your own dog waits at home, probably asleep on the fainting couch. You bought him a cravat last week. You tell people it was a joke, but you know better. You've been infected by the etiquette of animals. You now speak to them more freely than to most people. They don't judge your vocabulary or your scent or the way you overwater your plants. They just exist comfortably within the same strange, perfumed, rule-ridden world. And for that, you adore them. You leave the park, your boots dusty, your gloves slightly dog-haired. You pass a pigeon sitting proudly on a wrought iron fence. You nod and nods back. You both understand the unspoken code. You wake up already exhausted by the weight of your own garments, knowing that today will demand an especially delicate balance between appearing modest and being fashionable, between demonstrating wealth and denying vanity. Because in Victorian times, your clothing doesn't just protect you From the weather, it announces your morality, your class, your marital status, and whether or not you believe in progress. The moment you rise, you're aware that your entire day must be orchestrated around layers, not choices. Mind you, ears, your undergarments alone are a production. Chemise, drawers, corset, corset cover, crinoline, or bustle depending on the decade, petticoats, and then finally, the dress that the world will see, though ironically, it's the dress that matters least in this complex social equation. By now, you're used to having someone help you tighten the corset strings until your ribs whisper in protest and your spine decides it's time to grow in new directions. You take shallow breaths because deep ones aren't an option, and you move carefully, calculating every step lest your skirts become a deadly obstacle on the narrow staircase. The corset is the anchor of your entire outfit, and it also anchors society's expectations. It molds your figure to conform to an ideal that says, this woman is upright, self-controlled, and utterly without appetite. And if that sounds like a metaphor for the entire era, well, it is. Historians still argue whether corsets were purely instruments of patriarchal control, or whether some women embraced them as tools of elegance and autonomy. But as you clutch the bedpost and lean into your maid's knuckles, you don't have time to choose a side. You just need to breathe. Once your body is successfully remolded, it's time to select your outer dress, which must reflect the hour, the activity, and the social context. Morning gowns are soft, domestic, and meant to show you're not trying too hard. Afternoon dresses lean slightly more structured, often in shades of lilac, taupe, or navy, conveying sophistication without inciting gossip. Evening gowns, however, are theatrical. If you are unmarried, your shoulders are exposed, your gloves are opera length, and your neckline is just scandalous enough to imply fertility but not promiscuity. If you're married, your dresses darken, your sleeves lengthen, and your jewelry shifts from flirtation to confirmation you are taken, but still relevant. Don't even think about mixing those cues. A young lady who appears at a dinner party in a gown that's too mature risks being labeled fast. One who dresses too demurely might be pitied, or worse, overlooked. And while all this is swirling in your mind, you still need to consider the fabric. You cannot wear cotton to a dinner, just as you cannot wear velvet before dusk or lace in mourning, unless it is black and dull. Silk is appropriate for weddings, but only if it's not too shiny and doesn't outshine the bride. Wool is practical, but signals frugality. You once heard of a girl who was snubbed for wearing sateen to a garden party. Her family had to relocate. And then, of course, there's color, the language of mood, morality, and misstep. White is purity, unless you wear it too late in life, in which case it's considered delusional. Red is passion, but too much of it is theatrical and borderline improper. Blue is safe, yellow is bold, green is flirtatious, and purple suggests both wealth and mourning, depending on the shade. You remember a woman who wore emerald at a funeral and was never spoken to again, not because she intended disrespect, but because she misunderstood the emotional hex codes of the age. Your accessories, too, are carefully regulated. Gloves must match the activity. Long gloves are for formal affairs, while short gloves suggest casual visits or garden walks. You cannot eat with gloves on unless you're at a picnic, and even then, only if the food is pre-cut. Your hat must coordinate not only with your ensemble, but also with the weather, the month, and the angle of your face. You keep hat pins, not just for style, but for defense. There are stories of women stabbing trained gropers with a swift jab through the veil. Your parasol is not optional. It shields you from the sun, yes, but more importantly, it signals that you are refined enough to fear tanning. Tanned skin implies labor, and labor implies poverty. Pale skin, therefore, is moral superiority. So you clutch your parasol like a scepter of virtue, even on cloudy days. Your shoes, buttoned, heeled, and entirely too small. You do not walk in them so much as glide, pretending your toes aren't curled in agony, and your arches aren't crying out for a chiropractor who won't exist for another century. Men, of course, dress differently. Their decisions boil down to a choice between black or gray, hat or no hat, sideburns or mustache. The standards for male fashion are rigid but simple. Look respectable, avoid flamboyance, and always carry a cane, even if you don't limp. A well-dressed man in a three-piece suit is considered trustworthy. A poorly dressed man is assumed to be plotting something illegal. And heaven forbid you forget your cravat. Your cravat is your resume. But even men have rules. Hats must be removed indoors. Gloves must be worn when shaking hands with ladies. And trousers must never cling. You once heard a tailor described as dangerous because his breeches fit too well. You laughed, then quickly pretended to cough. It is not just what you wear, but how you wear it. Posture is everything. Slouching suggests laziness and weak character. Crossing your legs is vulgar. Showing ankles is only acceptable if you are under 7 or being painted. When you sit, you must do so with your spine straight and your hands folded loosely in your lap. If your knees touch, you are improper. If they don't, you might fall. Either way, someone will notice. Even children are not spared. Little girls wear white until about the age of 10, when they graduate to pastels and light prints. Boys wear dresses until they're toilet trained. A tradition that confuses modern observers, but makes perfect sense to a society terrified of stains and breeches buttons. After that, boys enter a long purgatory of sailor suits, kilts, and velvet shorts that scream adorable, while silencing any hope of climbing trees with dignity. Clothing is so central to identity that you start to see people as ensembles rather than individuals. You know that Miss Grafton wears mauve every Tuesday, and that Mrs. Whitby's cameo brooch always points left, and you find it oddly comforting, like reading a living newspaper. Fashion is the social script, and no one wants to be caught improvising. And when you dare to, even slightly, there are consequences. A ruffle too wide, a hem too short, a feather too tall, and suddenly you are the subject of drawing room whispers and dinner party eye rolls. You once wore the same bonnet twice in 1 week and overheard someone call you economical in a tone that suggested you'd committed tax fraud. There are fashion disasters so epic they require a relocation. But despite all this, you learn to adapt. You learn which tailor understands your bust without needing a diagram. You find the dressmaker who can hide a pregnancy without hiding your waistline. You discover that if you wear navy and stand very still, no one asks questions. You begin to use fashion not just to comply, but to communicate. A red ribbon says, "I'm listening." A black sash says, "I'm mourning," but approachable. A lavender hat means you're about to gossip. You become fluent in textile, and eventually you discover that you are not simply wearing the clothes are wearing you. They shape how you walk, how you speak, how you think. You begin to sit differently, even in your nightgown. You catch yourself adjusting imaginary gloves in your sleep. The fabric and the rules have seeped into your marrow. Historians still debate whether Victorian fashion was a tool of repression or a quiet rebellion, stitched into seams and corset bones. But as you unhook your dress at the end of the day, your back aching your lungs, grateful you no longer need to ask, you've lived it. And tomorrow, you'll do it all over again, with a different brooch. You find yourself on a bustling Victorian street, surrounded by a swirl of smoke horse hooves and rigid politeness. And for a moment, you wonder how anyone managed to move through this urban labyrinth without spontaneously combusting from the sheer pressure of protocol and pollution. The air tastes like coal and cabbage. Your shoes are already coated in dust from cobblestones that haven't seen a broom since last Tuesday, and yet everyone around you maintains a miraculous facade of civility, as though stepping through soot is simply the price of progress. You dodge a delivery cart stacked with burlap sacks that may or may not contain flour, potatoes, or possibly ferret snow. One dares ask, can you? Observe how street etiquette is its own kind of ballet. There are rules unspoken, but strictly enforced. Pedestrians must stick to their side of the walkway based on class, and gender. Crossing the road requires the same strategy as chess. And if a gentleman doesn't tip his hat to a passing lady, he risks being the subject of scandal for weeks. The streets themselves are lined with signs of contradiction. Women in embroidered gowns stepping over puddles of raw sewage, newsboys shouting headlines about Queen Victoria's latest address, while barefoot and chimney sweeps, no taller than 10, scuttling like phantoms through alleyways in search of soot and a crust of bread. Despite the chaos, everything follows an invisible order. A police constable strolls past in his top hat and brass buttons, projecting a kind of moral geometry, even as he discreetly averts his gaze from the opium den tucked behind the fishmongers. You hear a distant bell, could be a fire engine, could be a muffin vendor rand. No one panics either way. That's the Victorian way. Remain composed, even when everything around you is unraveling like a badly spun wool sock. As you make your way toward the marketplace, you become aware of how many layers of etiquette control your every move. You may not speak to a stranger unless formally introduced. You may not enter a shop without removing your hat if you're male. If you're female, you may not browse too long in the confectionery unless you want to be mistaken for a woman of loose morals, or worse, a novelist. The shops themselves are equally fascinating and terrifying. In the milliners, every hat tells a story. Some whisper status, others scream aspiration, and a few simply lie. You pass a chemist's shop with bottles of arsenic displayed openly in the window, next to powders for whitening your teeth with nitric acid and lip stains made of carmine beetles. You begin to understand why the average Victorian medicine cabinet doubles as a crime scene. Historians still argue whether the dangers of Victorian urban life were exaggerated in later literature, or if people genuinely navigated a city that was one misstep away from a Dickensian tragedy. But either way, you move carefully, especially near manholes. Those things aren't always secure. The street noise is a living symphony of clatter, clop, cough, and hawker. A man with a monkey on his shoulder is selling roasted chestnuts next to a woman flogging lace doilies, embroidered with suspicious stains. The smell is indescribable, a potent cocktail of horse dung, coal smoke, fresh bread, and despair. You pass a beggar child who offers you a flower made of paper in exchange for a farthing and then runs off into the mist. You wonder briefly if she was real. She might have been a ghost, or worse, an allegory. At the corner, a carriage splashes through a puddle and misses you by mere inches, soaking a passing curate who does not break character, but instead solemnly blesses the driver with a dripping hand. Nearby, a lamplighter climbs his iron ladder to ignite the gaslight, his every movement a reminder that electric convenience is still decades away. The city runs on flame, steam, and grim determination. You pass under a railway bridge that drips questionable water and above which a train whistles like it's mourning something. Everyone is moving with purpose, and yet somehow they never seem to arrive. You turn into a quieter street now, a residential lane lined with identical row houses, where curtains twitched with the curiosity of 1,000 unseen eyes. Gossip here is currency, and your presence is already being logged into someone's mental ledger. A maid sweeps the doorstep in precise little motions that say she's been instructed to look busy until a boy in a starched collar stands perfectly still, probably being punished for smiling on a Sunday. And somewhere behind one of those neatly painted doors, a woman in widow's black arranges the silverware for a guest who will never come. You walk on to pass a school where girls are being taught needlepoint and restraint while boys are learning Latin, geometry, and the art of ignoring their emotions. The schoolmistress frowns at you for existing too visibly. You cross paths with a lady of high status accompanied by a chaperone and a lapdog in matching bonnets. The dog sneezes. The chaperone apologizes. The lady does not. Class hierarchy seeps from every brick. You pass a workhouse with barred windows and a smell that stings the soul. Outside, two men in threadbare coats exchange a piece of stale bread and pretend it's a bargain. This is also the city. Dignity clings on by a fingernail here, and you feel suddenly overwhelmed by the range of realities stacked within one street. Opulence and destitution sharing a sidewalk. Delicacy and filth competing for attention, and always the looming pressure to appear unbothered by it all. You stop at a public notice board where someone has posted a flyer about temperance meetings, another about a missing cat, and several more detailing the upcoming execution schedule, because apparently those are public entertainment. You stare at the names, the crimes, the dates. Some were thieves, others accused of witchcraft or impersonating nobility. You don't know what's more disturbing, the acts themselves or the cheerful calligraphy used to announce them. Farther along, you reach a park, the rare green lung of the city, where the rules change but do not loosen. You may promenade, but you must not gallop. You may read, but only if the material is visibly edifying. You may feed the ducks, but not with meat. Children play under the weary eye of governesses, their laughter careful not to rise above a certain pitch. A man in a top hat reads aloud from Byron to a woman pretending to care. Everyone's pretending. Really, this entire world is a theater of appearances, and you realize that every step you take is part of the performance. The rules aren't just about etiquette, they're about survival. You light no fires unless you're licensed. You carry a handkerchief at all times because sneezing without one is basically a crime. You do not whistle. You do not spit. You definitely do not loiter. Loitering implies unemployment, which implies poverty, which implies moral failure. You pass a constable again, and he nods at you. You nod back. This is a ritual. Not acknowledging him would be suspicious. Over acknowledging him would be madness. Your feet ache, your gloves itch, and you've learned more about social navigation in one afternoon than in all your years of education. You glance upward at the soot-drenched sky and wonder what happens when it rains. Do the rules change? Do the classes blur? Does everyone just go home and pretend they're not coughing up chimney residue? You suspect not. In Victorian times, even the weather is managed with stoic resolve. A woman could give birth during a hailstorm and still be expected to send thank you notes within the week. A man could lose his leg in a factory and still apologize for bleeding on the carpet. As the gas lights flicker on and the city begins to glow with its strange, mechanical heartbeat, you start making your way home. Careful not to draw attention, not to stray from the acceptable paths, not to speak too loudly, not to forget that at any moment, someone could be judging the way you hold your umbrella. You are in public. You are a character in a morality play written by 1,000 nosy neighbors, and the curtain never falls. You wake to the muffled chime of a distant bell tower, its clang echoing through a gray dawn, thick with fog, and before your eyes even open fully, you remember that today is a Sunday, which, in Victorian times, means a meticulously orchestrated pause from worldly chaos, but only in the way a still statue is paused. Stiff, reverent, and deeply uncomfortable. The Sabbath is not just a spiritual day, but a social performance, and you're already behind by waking without prayer. You rise slowly, careful not to make noise that might be considered inappropriate, because even footsteps carry moral weight this morning. You reach for your Sunday attire, heavier, more formal, and somehow more scratchy than weekday clothing, and begin the ceremonial layering of your body in fabrics meant to both conceal and discipline. If you're a man, your cravat must be tied just so, your waistcoat buttoned up to the chin, and your boots buffed until they blind birds mid-flight. If you're a woman, you must achieve the holy trinity of modesty. No ankles, no collarbones, no opinions. With your clothing sanctified, you proceed to breakfast, which is minimal by designing heartily before church, would imply gluttony. And besides, the focus today must be spiritual nourishment. A single piece of toast and a boiled egg, if you're lucky, washed down with tea that tastes suspiciously of last Sunday's sermon. Children, if present, must not speak above a whisper. And no one, not even the family dog, is allowed to run, laugh, or breathe with too much enthusiasm. You glance at the clock and realize it's time for the main event. Church. The walk there is silent and solemn, like a slow funeral for spontaneity. Even the birds seem to chirp more demurely on Sundays. As you approach the towering Gothic spire of your parish church, you see other families arriving in neat processions, each trying to outpace the next. There's an invisible contest in every step. Who bows more reverently? Who whispers the Lord's Prayer with greater emotion? Who manages to look both sorrowful and stylish? Inside, the air is cold, damp, and thick with incense and judgment. You take your place in the pew, seating dictated not by piety, but by social rank nobility at the front, tradesmen near the middle, and the barely tolerated poor shuffled toward the back, assuming they're allowed in at all. The pews are hard, the hymns longer than necessary, and the sermon a complex braid of moral instruction, passive-aggressive anecdotes, and dire warnings about dancing, playing cards, or showing your wrists in public. You try to follow along, but the vicar's voice drones like a sermon delivered underwater, You glance at the stained glass colorful saints locked forever in perfect posture, and you wonder how many people in this very room are using prayer time to plan their afternoon gossip. Historians still argue whether Victorian religiosity was deeply felt or simply socially enforced. But one thing's certain: the pressure to appear devout was immense. Church wasn't just a spiritual obligation, it was the cornerstone of your public image. A weekly roll call for the morally upright. Missing service could trigger rumors, whispers, or worse, an unexpected visit from the vicar, who would smile gently while judging your soul and your furniture. After service, the congregation spills out like molasses, slow and sticky, and the real ritual begins: the Sunday walk. This is not mere exercise, it's a promenade of virtue. Families stroll together down well-trodden paths, always neatly spaced, never hurried, and absolutely never cheerful. You greet acquaintances with slow nods and phrases like "a blessed day, isn't it?" Or "did you find the sermon especially moving today?" knowing full well that no one actually did. And if someone dares to chuckle or speak of anything secular, like the price of coal or the neighbor's suspiciously frequent piano tunes, they're met with a disapproving sniff from a widow who hasn't smiled since the Crimean War. Upon returning home, the house is quieter than usual because even your furniture respects the Sabbath. No music is allowed unless it's a hymn, and even then, only at an acceptable volume and tempo. No board games, no novels unless written by someone tragically dead and preferably male. No idle chatter, and certainly no physical games like hoop rolling or lawn tennis. You may read scripture, you may sew quietly, you may stare at the fire and contemplate your mortality. But above all, you must not appear to be enjoying yourself. Sunday joy is the kind that wears a tight collar and apologizes afterward. Lunch is served slightly more elaborately than breakfast, but even this is not about pleasure, it's about gratitude. Roast beef or lamb, perhaps, with overboiled carrots and potatoes. Served with grace, said aloud, and a sense of moral righteousness as seasoning. The meal ends with a plain pudding and a thick blanket of silence. You are then expected to rest, but not nap. Napping is slothful. You may recline. You may close your eyes in quiet contemplation. But sleeping, that's for lesser souls. The afternoon stretches before you like a woolen carpet soaked in gray tea. You might write a letter to a distant aunt. You might polish the silver. You might reread last week's church bulletin and marvel at how nothing ever changes. Outside, the town seems frozen. Shops are closed. Taverns are silent. The only sound is the occasional tolling of the church bell, reminding you that salvation, like punctuality, is always being watched. You think of the Sabbath restrictions placed upon children, especially no toys, no skipping, no whistling, just Bible stories, quiet hands, and an early bedtime. One mother once reportedly sewed her son's pockets shut on Sundays to prevent him from carrying marbles. Another scolded her daughter for smiling too widely after Psalms. Victorian Sabbath observance was not just rule-driven, it was rule-obsessed. Some towns went so far as to outlaw Sunday public transportation, Sunday mail delivery, even Sunday ice cream sales. Because if there's one thing Victorian society feared, it was accidental delight. As evening approaches, you prepare for a second church service, yes. Evening church was a thing. And yes, skipping it was only permissible if you were either dead or playing the organ. This time the sermon is shorter, but no less dense. And you once again squeeze into a pew alongside equally exhausted souls who stare at the vicar like he holds the key to both heaven and their social status. You sing the hymns, your voice hoarse from politeness, and when the final amen echoes through the rafters, you feel a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the Sabbath is nearly over, dread that it begins again in 7 days. Back home, the day ends with a light supper, cold meats, bread, perhaps a bit of pickled something, and an evening devotional. Families gather around a candle or lamp. Someone reads from Psalms, and the others nod solemnly, while secretly yearning for Monday's chaos to return. Even children, normally wild by nature, sit like porcelain dolls, waiting to be released from the sacred stillness of the day. As you undress for bed slowly, quietly, modestly, you reflect on the sheer architecture of control that built this Sunday. Every gesture, every bite, every word measured and monitored by invisible threads of expectation. You realize that while Victorian Sundays were nominally about rest, they were, in truth, a masterclass in restraint, an endurance trial for the soul, and a subtle lesson in societal power. You wonder if anyone truly felt closer to the divine by the end of it, or if they simply felt cleaner, quieter, and more compliant. Maybe both. Probably neither. Either way, you crawl into bed with your hymnal on the nightstand. Your thoughts a mix of psalms and personal rebellion, and you fall asleep beneath the oppressive peace of a world where even God observes etiquette. You find yourself standing in the drawing room of a Victorian household, where the air seems to thicken with every tick of the grandfather clock, not from heat or smoke, but from the crushing weight of social obligation. Because now comes the part of the day that truly tests your stamina, not labor. Not chores, not even worship, but visiting, calling, and receiving guests, all governed by a code so intricate, even the Oxford English Dictionary might hesitate to define it. And the moment you spot the calling card tray on the hall table polished, pristine, and glinting like an altary, know the ritual has begun. For in the world of Victorian social customs, visiting wasn't just a nicety, it was a battleground of status. A carefully choreographed ballet in which one misstep could cost you your reputation. And the rules begin with the calling card, a simple rectangle of thick paper bearing your name in ornate script, no address, no phone number, just identity distilled to typography. And this tiny slip must be deployed with military precision. If you're paying a formal call, you must present it to the butler, who will examine it as if checking for forged currency, and then perhaps carry it to the lady of the house, unless you're considered unworthy, in which case your card joins the stack of hopefuls gathering dust near the umbrella stand. And if your card is accepted and you are granted entry, you must then navigate a minefield of decorum that starts with seating, arrangement you are not to sit unless invited. And when you do, you perch, you do not sprawl, and your hat, gloves, and parasol must all be managed without fuss or fidgeting. For signs of nervous hands imply a nervous soul, and that simply won't do. And once seated, the real challenge begins. Conversation, which must be polite, superficial, and endlessly bland. You speak of the weather, of the Queen, of your cousin's trip to Bath, of Lady Fenwick's admirable embroidery, and under no circumstances do you mention politics, money, illness, or any subject that might accidentally resemble reality. Because visiting is not about connection, it's about performance, and you are here not to bond, but to demonstrate that you know how to behave. and visits are short, 15 to 20 minutes, no more or less. Tea is offered, in which case you are permitted to linger slightly longer, sipping weak Darjeeling and nibbling on rock-hard biscuits while pretending to find the hosts. Pet spaniel, fascinating, and when you leave you must compliment the decor, praise the garden if visible, and say how lovely it's been, regardless of how stifling the atmosphere or how judgmental the host's gaze. And the moment you step outside, you sigh not from relief but from calculation, because now you must consider your own receiving day, the designated weekly time when you're expected to open your home to a flood of acquaintances hoping to prove their social worth. And you must be ready, because anyone may come, and your drawing room must be impeccable, your attire fresh, your demeanor warm but not too warm. And God help you if you forget someone's name or misremember a family detail, for Victorians had memories like steel traps. When it came to social slights and being snubbed intentionally or not was grounds for a decade-long vendetta. And what makes all this worse is that everyone, especially women, was judged, not by the quality of their minds or the depth of their feelings, but by their adherence to these absurdly specific rituals. And while men, at least, had the option of the club or the office as a social release valve, women were largely confined to this exhausting theater of civility, where afternoon visits carried as much tension as a duel, except with more doilies and fewer pistols. And historians still argue whether these customs fostered a sense of community or simply reinforced class boundaries. But what's certain is that every visit, every card, every cup of tepid tea served as a quiet referendum on your social legitimacy. And speaking of cards, there's a whole language to them. Corners turned down meant different things. Pencil notes scribbled on the back could imply congratulations, condolences, or a vague promise to call again. And woe betide the person who confused a mourning card with a celebratory one, for such an error would be discussed behind fans for weeks. And if you were single, things became even more complicated, because calling was also a subtle courtship arena where young men would leave cards for eligible young women, and those women, under the strict supervision of their mothers, might return the gesture if suitably impressed. But no one dared speak of feelings directly, oh no. Instead, it was all glances and phrasing, and who called on whom, when, and how many days had passed since the last call, and what color ribbon was worn during the visit. Because romance, like everything else in Victorian society, was filtered through 12 layers of etiquette and 17 layers of clothing. And yet, despite all this, or perhaps because of it, the calling card system persisted, a strange fusion of surveillance and civility, where you tracked your place in the social hierarchy by the cards you received, the cards you returned, and the doors that remained stubbornly closed. And of course, there were exceptions: bohemians who flouted the rules, radicals who refused to call, artists who turned calling cards into tiny political statements. But they were regarded with suspicion, even pity, by those entrenched in the system. And besides, such rebellion rarely gained traction beyond fashionable circles in London. And for most, especially in provincial towns, the system was as fixed as the stars. And every Sunday evening, you would review your calling card book, noting who had called and when, planning your responses, assessing whether a reciprocal visit was required. And this bookkeeping was not optional, it was as essential as the Bible or the tea set, because failing to return a call within a week was tantamount to declaring social war, and no one wanted that, not in a world where status could be lost as easily as a misplaced glove. And so you obeyed. You visited, you called, you smiled, and in the process, you built a life around fragments of conversation, strategically offered compliments, and an endless cycle of polite, mutual pretending. And while you sometimes dreamed of tearing the whole thing down, of sending a calling card shaped like a middle finger, or arriving unannounced in pajamas, you never did, because deep down, you understood that Victorian visiting rituals were less about personal connection and more about public theater, a daily performance in which everyone had a role, and the penalty for forgetting your lines was nothing short of exile. And so you continued, card in hand, smile in place, soul quietly screaming, but posture impeccable. You find yourself pacing through a Victorian street, shoes clicking sharply on cobbled stones as a faint mist drapes everything in a murky veil. And as you glance around, it's impossible to ignore the strange landscape of personal hygiene, or rather, the fascinating lack thereof, because in this refined, corseted world of propriety and lace-trimmed virtue, cleanliness, ironically, was more of an abstract aspiration than a consistent habit. And the deeper you wander into this reality, the more absurd it becomes, starting with the simple act of bathing, which, for most people, was a weekly ordeal, if that, often reserved for Saturdays, and conducted with the solemnity of a religious rite. For running water was rare, indoor plumbing even rarer, and heating enough water to bathe involved a process that would exhaust a modern camper first. You hauled buckets from the well or pump, then boiled it on the stove, then poured it into a basin or tin tub, and finally, you sat in it, awkwardly folded, half freezing, half scalding, while a curtain of steam blurred your vision and any sense of dignity, and the water that was shared by the whole family in descending order of social importance, which meant that if you were the youngest or a servant, your bath was more like soup seasoned with other people's filth. And despite this, Victorians didn't think of themselves as unclean. They thought of themselves as moral and refined, because to them, cleanliness was as much about appearance and self-control as it was about actual sanitation. And that's where the layers of clothing, powders, and perfumes came in, functioning less as aesthetic choices and more as olfactory armor. Because you might be sweating profusely under 5 layers of wool and cotton, but as long as your cuffs were stiff and your collar starched, you were considered civilized. And if the smell became too much, you simply added more lavender sachets to your pockets or dabbed rose water behind your ears, for the Victorian nose was expected to remain politely blind. And speaking of noses, let's talk about dental hygiene, or what passed for it, because toothbrushes existed, yes, but they were made of bone or wood with bristles from pigs or horses. And toothpaste was often a concoction of chalk, charcoal, or crushed shells, sometimes laced with soap or even brick dust. And though some people cleaned their teeth regularly, many others didn't bother unless they had reason to smile at high society, which is why dental decay was rampant, breath was often dire, and dentistry itself was an unholy combination of carpentry and cruelty, where extractions were done with pliers, no anesthesia, and a prayer, and dentures, if you could afford them, were made from ivory, porcelain, or in some haunting cases, real human teeth scavenged from corpses after battles like Waterloo, which, yes, meant your genteel grandmother might be sipping tea with molars once belonging to a dead French soldier, and yet nobody flinched, because to Victorians dental health wasn't medical. It was moral. Bad teeth were a sign of weakness or laziness, unless you were rich enough to hide them. And of course, your breath might be a hazard to canaries, but as long as you knew how to curtsy or tip your hat, society would forgive it. And while your teeth quietly rotted, your hair posed its own challenges, because shampoo as we know it didn't exist, and washing one's hair was a rare event, often avoided entirely by men and dreaded by women, who instead relied on dry powders, vigorous brushing, and elaborate updos to manage the increasingly sentient tangles forming beneath their bonnets. And when lice inevitably moved inland, they always did it, was addressed with combs dipped in vinegar, kerosene, or mercury-based lotions that burned the scalp while possibly damaging your nervous system. And yet these risks were considered acceptable in the pursuit of elegance. And if you're imagining only the lower classes suffered such grim conditions, think again, because even in the drawing rooms of the elite, the struggle for cleanliness was constant and losing water closets were a novelty. Chamber pots still common, and it wasn't unheard of for maids to fling the contents out of windows into the street. Which is why parasols weren't just for sun and fashion. They were shields against falling filth. And if you've ever walked down a street and wondered why Victorian women wore such wide-brimmed hats, well, now you know. And of course, public sanitation was equally theatrical. London's sewers were famously overwhelmed, especially during the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell from the Thames became so unbearable that Parliament suspended meetings. And this event finally spurred the construction of a modern sewer system, though even after it was completed, many homes remained unconnected. And the miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, remained dominant until germ theory gained traction in the latter half of the century, sparking fierce debates among scholars and physicians, some of whom clung stubbornly to the old ways, insisting that as long as one's corset was tight and windows were shut, no illness could breach a respectable household. And speaking of illness, the Victorian body was a battlefield of contradictions, wrapped in virtue and corsetry, yet riddled with ailments from tuberculosis to typhoid to mysterious female nervous disorders treated with bed rest, cold baths, or vibrators, though no one dared name them as such. And if a lady swooned, it was attributed to her delicate constitution rather than the fact that she hadn't eaten solid food in days and her ribcage was being slowly crushed. And while the upper classes suffered these indignities with lace-trimmed stoicism, the working classes endured even worse factory labor, coal dust, overcrowded tenements with no ventilation, and shared outdoor privies that bred disease faster than a scandal spread through a parlor room. And yet through it all, society clung to the illusion of cleanliness, the myth that respectability could be starched and perfumed into being. And perhaps the strangest part of all was the Victorian obsession with purity as a moral and physical goal, symbolized in the cult of cold water bathing, where plunging into icy rivers or standing under freezing pumps was thought to build character and fend off sin. Which is why you might find yourself dragged at dawn to a freezing bathhouse and expected to emerge with not just numb limbs, but a renewed soul, because in this age, bodily suffering was seen as spiritually uplifting, and pain, when voluntary, became proof of one's moral fortitude. And while this might seem bizarre to modern minds, it made perfect sense in a world where virtue was a performance and the body merely its stage. And so you continue walking down that damp, narrow street, the hem of your coat growing heavy with moisture, and your boots slick with mud, and you pass people who look tidy, composed, even elegant, but you now know the truth that beneath the crinolines and waistcoats, lies a world of unwashed realities, a kingdom of soaps too precious to use and water too scarce to waste. A society where cleanliness is less about hygiene and more about hiding the grime well enough to be invited to dinner. And you wonder if anyone ever truly felt clean, or if they simply learned to ignore the smell, the stains, and the lice in favor of a more pleasing fiction. And just as that thought settles, you spot a street vendor selling perfumed handkerchiefs and scented wax tablets meant to be worn in the bodice or tucked into top hats. And you almost laugh, because this small accessory, so dainty, so flagrant, is doing the work of an entire plumbing system. And as you keep walking, the mist thickens, the gas lamps flicker, and you begin to understand why Victorians were so obsessed with appearances. Because when reality smells this bad, the fantasy becomes not just preferable, it becomes survival. You step cautiously into the interior of a Victorian classroom, the air thick with chalk dust and discipline, and almost immediately, you're hit by a wave of stern silence, broken only by the rhythmic scratching of slate pencils and the occasional sniffle. Because schooling in the Victorian era wasn't about nurturing creativity or cultivating curiosity. It was about control, memorization, and conformity. And as you quietly take your place at a long wooden desk, shared with 3 other pupils, elbows tightly tucked and backs ramrod straight, you begin to understand that education here is not a right or a joy, but a duty often performed under duress. And it all starts with attendance. Because compulsory education didn't even exist until the Elementary Education Act of 1870. And even then, it wasn't truly enforced until the 1880s. So many children, especially those in working-class families, tended sporadically or not at all. And those who did often walked for miles, shoes worn to ribbons, to reach their board school. A government-funded institution, typically staffed by underpaid, overworked teachers who operated with military-like precision and zero tolerance for mischief. And once inside, you're greeted by cold benches, blackened coal stoves in winter, and a system that prized obedience above all. For this was not a place to explore your inner world. It was a place to learn your place in society. And that learning began with the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Though the order of priority often varied depending on the social ambitions of the local parish. And lessons were drilled endlessly using rote, repetition, recitation, and recopying, which meant you might spend half your day copying the same proverb into your slate. Cleanliness is next to godliness, or idle hands are the devil's workshop, over and over again, until your wrist ached and your mind numbed. And the teaching methods, if you can even call them that, were harsh mistakes, were corrected with a sharp crack of the cane or the sting of a ruler. And if you talked back or daydreamed, you might be forced to wear a dunce cap and stand in the corner, humiliated before your peers. And if you think that sounds excessive, consider the monitorial system where older pupils, barely more advanced than their juniors, were assigned to instruct the younger ones, resulting in a pedagogical nightmare where misinformation was passed like a game of academic telephone. And yet this system was praised for its efficiency and economy. And while historians still debate whether it provided any real learning or merely instilled fear, what's certain is that the line between correction and cruelty was incredibly thin. And the idea of childhood innocence, though romanticized in poetry and art, had little place in the actual classroom. where the child was seen as a small adult, already a moral being in need of shaping, and girls and boys were often taught separately, even when in the same school, with girls focused on needlework, deportment, and religious instruction, while boys were given more arithmetic and geography, though the latter was often taught through imperial maps that turned the globe into a big pink puzzle showing the far reach of British power. And yes, patriotism was embedded deep. Children sang songs about Queen and country, memorized the names of colonial outposts, and absorbed the notion that Britain's moral superiority justified its global dominance. And while the top of the class might win a certificate or a Bible, the bottom could expect ridicule or worse. And discipline extended beyond the academic. Your uniform had to be spotless, your hair neat, and your hands clean, or you might be inspected, scolded, or sent home in disgrace. And woe betide the child who spoke in a regional accent, because standard English was enforced with the fervor of religious doctrine, erasing dialects and identities in favor of a homogenized national character. And even the furniture conspired against you. Desks were narrow and bolted in place, making slouching impossible and collaboration harder still. And everything was designed to face forward, toward the blackboard and the authoritarian gaze of the teacher. And forget about art or music, unless you attended one of the elite private academies, because for the working class, education was utilitarian at best, a way to become a better clerk, factory worker, or domestic servant. And that's if you were lucky, because many children left school by the age of 10 or 11, either officially or through quiet absenteeism, to help support their families, whether by sweeping chimneys, delivering newspapers, or sewing buttons by candlelight. And while Sunday school provided some moral instruction, it was often just an extension of church authority, designed more to teach obedience and sin awareness than critical thought. And textbooks were often outdated, filled with moralistic tales and pseudoscientific diagrams that reinforced the social order and gender roles. And even subjects like biology were laced with Victorian values, plants and animals categorized not just by genus, but by moral virtue, with industrious ants praised and idle butterflies scorned. And history, that was a parade of monarchs, wars, and male heroes, with little attention paid to ordinary people or uncomfortable truths. And if you think school lunches might have been a bright spot, think again. There were no school lunches, just whatever crusts or scraps a child could bring from home, and many went hungry, their stomachs growling louder than the recitations. And still they were expected to sit still, answer questions, and not faint, though it wasn't uncommon for children to collapse from hunger or illness, only to be dragged outside, revived, and sent back to their seat, with a stern warning not to disrupt the lesson. And yet amidst this grim tableau, there were occasional glimmers of humanity. Some teachers genuinely cared, offering quiet encouragement or extra help to struggling pupils. And some schools experimented with games, nature walks, or singing, though such innovations were often frowned upon as frivolous or dangerously liberal. And while corporal punishment was the norm, its excesses sometimes drew public criticism, especially when stories emerged of children bruised or broken by overzealous masters, prompting government inquiries and calls for reform, though real change was agonizingly slow. And all the while, the class divide remained stark. Wealthy children, who were privately tutored or sent to prestigious institutions with Latin, fencing, and piano lessons, while poor children shared slates, worn books, and overworked teachers in drafty rooms. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is how this system, despite its many flaws, planted the seeds for future progress, because literacy rates did rise, and a generation that once had no schooling now learned to read and write. And though the curriculum was narrow and rigid, the act of education itself began to shift expectations, creating space for future reforms and new visions of childhood. And as you sit at that desk, spine aching fingers cramping around your slate pencil, you realize that for many Victorian children, school was not a place of wonder, but a proving ground, a crucible in which they were tested, shaped, and often scarred, yet also paradoxically prepared for the very world that oppressed them. And you begin to understand why so many later reformers, educators, and philosophers looked back on this era with a mix of horror and gratitude, recognizing both the damage done and the groundwork laid. And as the school bell finally rings a harsh clang that echoes down the hall like a factory whistle, you rise with the others, filing out in silence, eyes low, backs still straight, and the day is done. But the lesson lingers not in your mind, but in your posture, your restraint, your ability to follow rules even when they make no sense, because that, above all, is what Victorian schooling taught best. You emerge from the rigid stillness of the classroom only to find yourself thrust into an entirely different kind of Victorian crucible, the domestic realm, the private sphere, the silent battlefield of home life. And as you cross the threshold of a proper Victorian house, you're instantly engulfed in a maze of formality so dense it feels almost sacred, and yet utterly suffocating. Because nothing in this household happens by accident or whim, and every object, every sound, even every pause in conversation has its expected place. Starting with the very architecture of the house itself, where rooms are not designed for convenience or comfort, but for moral signaling for the sitting. Room must always look lived in, but not too lived in. The parlor must be adorned with delicate knickknacks that no one ever touches, and heaven help you if you place a chair at an odd angle or leave a cushion askew, because to do so would unravel the entire illusion of propriety. And you soon understand that the home isn't just a place to live, it's a shrine to appearances, a stage on which everyone must perform. And nowhere is that performance more suffocating than in the roles people are forced to play within it, starting with the Victorian patriarch, who is supposed to be the calm, benevolent ruler of this domestic kingdom, though in practice he's often distant, brooding, and emotionally unavailable, appearing mostly at meals or in the study, which functions as his private sanctuary, a mahogany tomb of books, pipes, and dusty order, while the mother, in contrast, is not afforded such solitude, for she is the engine that keeps this societal clockwork ticking, organizing the meals, the maid, the children, the family schedule, the social visits, and the seasonal linen change, all while maintaining an expression of gracious calm. And Victorian society loves to wax poetic about the angel in the house, but in truth, she's more like the unpaid manager of an impossibly high-stakes hotel, expected to host flawlessly while suppressing any hint of dissatisfaction or fatigue. And then there are the children, many adults dressed like porcelain dolls, trained from infancy in the arts of silence, obedience, and premature responsibility, their days segmented into education, supervised play, and compulsory gratitude. Because to be a Victorian child is to carry the full weight of your family's expectations on your tiny, starched shoulders, and you eat what you're given, sit where you're told, and never ever interrupt. And if you do speak, It must be with polished grammar, reverent tone, and ideally in a way that reflects well on your mother's parenting. Because in this household, even the way you sneeze reflects on your upbringing. And speaking of sneezing, cleanliness isn't just a habit, it's a declaration of moral worth. And the obsession with hygiene reaches biblical proportions, with bathtubs hauled into drawing rooms once a week, servants heating kettle after kettle to provide enough water for a tepid half-submersion. And this is if you're lucky, because if you're working class or poor, your concept of hygiene might involve a shared tin basin, a rag, and a prayer. But even among the wealthier classes, there's a fixation on bodily control. Mouthing, posture, and scent are all under constant scrutiny. And the rules don't stop at hygiene, because even emotions are subject to etiquette, with open displays of affection, anger, or grief frowned upon unless filtered through proper channels like poetry, prayer, or a formally worded letter. And love, that most unruly of emotions, must wear a corset just like everything else. And yes, even marital relationships are governed by a code of unspoken expectations, where affection is hinted at through the placement of a hand or a carefully chosen turn of phrase, but rarely expressed directly, because overt passion is considered vulgar, even in private. And of course, the servants see everything, from the whispered arguments to the carefully staged reconciliations. For the Victorian home is not just a family residence, it's a surveillance zone. And the more affluent you are, the more people you have watching you, dressing you, preparing your meals, and quietly judging whether your tea habits align with your social class. And while many households rely on cooks, maids, governesses, and footmen to run smoothly, the hierarchy is always crystal clear, and servants must remain invisible unless summoned, speak only when addressed, and maintain a demeanor of cheerful servitude, even when working 18-hour days for a fraction of a living wage. And historians still argue whether the Victorian home was a sanctuary from public life or merely a continuation of its pressures under a different roof. But what's undeniable is how much the domestic space reflected and reinforced broader societal values of gender hierarchy, class division, and obsessive control, and even was moralized, with clutter seen as a sign of mental disorder, while sparse rooms indicated coldness or social pretension, and the ideal was somewhere in between, just enough decoration to suggest taste, not so much as to suggest vanity. And yes, that extends to the reading material on your table, which must be morally upright. Think Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, maybe a Charles Dickens novel if you want to seem progressive, but definitely not anything French or sensational, because the line between literature and moral decay was, according to many Victorians, frighteningly thin. And if you're a guest in this home, you must tread just as carefully. Coasters must be used without being asked. Compliments must be effusive, but not exaggerated. And you must never touch or even comment on anything you suspect might be an heirloom unless invited to do so. And don't even think about discussing religion or politics at the dinner table, unless you want to spark a domestic Cold War that could last generations. And speaking of dinner, mealtimes themselves are theatrical events, complete with multiple courses, elaborate place settings, and unwritten seating charts that dictate who sits where and speaks to whom. And if you're unmarried, your placement reveals your desirability, while if you're widowed, it broadcasts your availability or lack thereof, depending on the candle count and the proximity to the host. And as the meal progresses, you navigate a minefield of forks, fish knives, and conversational etiquette so precise it could be done in dance. And you perform the dance well, even as your corset pinches and your feet swell, because that's what's expected. And when dinner is over, the ladies retire to the drawing room while the men remain to drink port and talk business. And this separation is not just customary, it's essential to preserving the illusion that men and women occupy different moral universes. And so you sit, sip, smile, and silently long for the end of the evening, which can't come soon enough. But when it finally does, you thank your hosts profusely, reiterate how lovely everything has been, and step back out into the night, exhausted not from activity, but from maintaining the social pose. And you realize then that the Victorian home, for all its talk of love and virtue, is less a refuge and more a crucible of constant performance. And you begin to wonder how many people actually found peace here, and how many simply learned to act like they had. You drift away from the shadowy confines of the Victorian home and wander into the crisp, fog-laced streets, where the public face of society puts on its own brand of theater. And if you thought the domestic realm was a tightly choreographed performance, wait until you feel the pressure of behaving correctly under the eyes of the world. Because in Victorian times, the notion of public decency was almost militant, a never-ending list of invisible rules that everyone was expected to follow. And if you broke them even accidentally, risked social death or worse. And the first thing you notice as you step into the thoroughfare is the way people walk, not just with purpose, but with restraint, keeping a precise distance from one another, never locking eyes too long, never moving too quickly, lest they appear disorderly or undignified. And this choreography is most severe in women, who must walk with a measured grace, never swinging their arms, never lifting their skirts higher than the ankle, even when puddles threaten to soak their hems, and their heads must be held just so. Eyes lowered, lips closed, spine straight as if a yardstick has been permanently affixed to their backs. And heaven help them if they stumble or smile too widely or speak to a man without a chaperone. Because public propriety for women is a daily minefield, one misstep away from scandal. And while men enjoy slightly more latitude, they too are bound by rules. From the tilt of their hat to the angle of their bow, and etiquette guides printed during this period go into excruciating detail on everything from how to accept a business card without seeming too eager to the correct method of ascending a staircase in polite company. And as you make your way through a bustling Victorian market square filled with the scent of coal smoke, fresh bread, and horse manure, you're suddenly struck by how deeply stratified the public space is, not just between rich and poor, but between who is allowed to linger and who must move along. Because loitering, unless you're wealthy and well-dressed, is immediately suspect, and constables routinely patrol public parks and corners, scanning for any deviation from the norm. And if you're a woman alone without a clear purpose or destination, you risk being mistaken for a sex worker, regardless of your actual intentions. And if you're a child too long from school or home, you may be seized as a vagrant or worse, enrolled in one of the city's many brutal reform institutions, and even leisure comes with strings attached. Because Victorian society does not believe in idle amusement, every pastime must have a purpose, ideally one that improves the mind or morals, which is why musical evenings, public lectures, and organized nature walks flourish, while dancing and theater are eyed suspiciously, unless properly sanctioned by a high society host or charitable cause. And you might be surprised to learn that even laughter in public was considered borderline inappropriate unless carefully modulated. And yes, there are entire etiquette pamphlets dedicated to teaching people how to laugh without offending delicate ears, which is frankly ridiculous, but very on brand for the Victorians. And dress, of course, is a battlefield of propriety, all on its own, because what you wear says everything about your character, your finances, your marital status, and your moral fiber. And a single torn hem or loose button could trigger whispers and judgment for days. So everyone dresses like they're auditioning for a statue, layering crinolines, gloves, petticoats, and top hats even in the heat of summer, with sweat pouring under woolen collars that no one dares loosen. And when the heat gets unbearable, no one dares mention it, because to complain about discomfort is to admit weakness. And Victorians would rather feign gracefully than do that. And you can't help but notice the sheer absurdity of it all, men sitting stoically in tailcoats as their backs soak through, women fanning themselves discreetly while pretending not to suffer, all to preserve an illusion of civility that no one actually enjoys, but everyone is too terrified to drop. And this terror is not just social, it's institutional, because the Victorian legal system and police force are increasingly empowered to enforce not just laws, but moral order. And the reach of surveillance grows ever longer with the rise of the Pelian principles that define the modern police as guardians of both law and public behavior. And so arrests could happen, not just for crimes, but for vagrancy, loitering, lewd dress, or even impudence. A vague charge used liberally against anyone who didn't sufficiently defer to authority, and public shaming was still very much in vogue. From stocks to pillories to newspaper columns that published the names of women accused of immorality. And historians still argue whether this strict moral policing was meant to stabilize society or simply control the working class and women. But either way, it had its intended effect: fear kept everyone in line, and even the architecture reinforced these values with public buildings designed to awe and intimidate, rising in stately columns and grand facades that reminded you of your place, while poorhouses and workhouses looked like prisons, which they often effectively were, meant not just to house the poor, but to punish them for existing. And even the city streets were divided by class, with elegant promenades for the elite and grimy back alleys for the laboring masses. And crossing from one to the other could earn you looks, comments, or worse. And yet, despite all this rigid control, or perhaps because of it, a thriving subculture of rebellion existed just beneath the surface sand, underworld of artists, performers, political radicals, and eccentric dreamers who used satire, fashion, and coded language to poke fun at the system. And they knew that a well-timed mustache or an ironic calling card could scandalize an entire drawing room. And fringe communities like spiritualists, cross-dressers, and anarchists found ways to exist in coded visibility, walking a tightrope between transgression and performance. And the sheer effort required to maintain appearances meant that moments of authentic humanity, unscripted laugh, an accidental sneeze, a genuine compliment shone like gold. And it's in these rare glimmers that you feel the contradiction at the heart of Victorian public life. The more it demands performance, the more it secretly yearns for sincerity. And as you watch a couple discreetly reach for each other's hands under the pretense of passing a parasol, or a street musician close his eyes and play not for coin, but for love of melody, you realize that beneath the rigid surface, there is a deep, untapped hunger for connection, one that all the etiquette books in the world can't fully erase. And you begin to understand that the true legacy of Victorian public behavior is not just its repression, but the ingenious ways people found to slip past it, to carve out tiny moments of freedom in a world that wanted every moment accounted for. And so you walk on, past the gaslit streets and ornate lampposts, past the puffed chests and pursed lips, feeling both suffocated and oddly inspired by a world where nothing is allowed, but everything, somehow, still happens. You don't just observe the rules anymore. You breathe them, wear them, sleep under them, like a scratchy wool blanket you can't quite escape. And now, as the late Victorian years stretch before you, you sense not a loosening of control, but a tightening, a last desperate gasp of moral rigidity before the world lurches toward modernity. Because the strangest thing about the rules of this era isn't just their absurdity, but the sheer willpower it took to keep them alive, even as cracks formed in every corner of society. And by now, you've survived corsets and calling cards, household hierarchies, and the tyranny of public manners. But this final stretch is where the contradictions start to pile up so thickly you can't help but trip over them. Because just as the Victorians claimed to value reason and science, they're also up to their eyeballs in mysticism and ghost clubs, consulting mediums by candlelight after attending lectures on Darwin's theories by day. And just as they claim to uphold sexual purity, their underbelly teems with brothels, coded literature, and secret diaries locked in mahogany drawers. And you feel this strange friction everywhere in the streets where chimney sweeps brush past ladies in lace gloves, in the churches where sermons denounce the very pleasures society can't stop indulging, and in the drawing rooms where women read novels under the guise of improving their minds, while quietly questioning everything they've been taught. And the more the Victorians talk about propriety, the more obvious it becomes that they are afraid, terrified, even of change, of freedom, of their own desires. And nowhere is this more evident than in their laws, which become increasingly bizarre the deeper you dig. Like how it was illegal to commit suicide, but also illegal to attempt it and fail, meaning that a failed suicide attempt could land you in prison, as if the punishment could somehow outweigh the pain, and how blasphemy laws could result in lengthy sentences just for uttering the wrong words in the wrong place, and how laws around homosexuality became more severe even as coded queer communities found ways to exist in plain sight, wearing green carnations and frequenting Molly houses and writing letters in elaborate euphemisms. And historians still argue whether Victorian repression was more dangerous in its hypocrisy or its reach. But one thing is clear: the rules did not just exist in law books or etiquette guides. They lived in people's heads, carving grooves into thought itself, shaping every decision, every hesitation, every apology for things that shouldn't require one. And it wasn't just upper-class society affected, because the middle and working classes, too, absorbed these rules through schools, churches, public notices, and the constant gaze of neighbors ready to report the slightest impropriety. And entire careers could be destroyed by gossip, marriages ruined by a misread glance, and lives unraveled by nothing more than a poorly timed visit. And yet, even in this tightly bound society, you begin to see the early tremors of resistance, suffragettes chaining themselves to gates, writers mocking the establishment through satire and serialized novels, spiritualists defying religious dogma by channeling what they believed were voices from beyond the veil. And behind every pearl-clutching reaction lies the fear that the world is about to change irreversibly. And they're right, of course, because the turn of the century is coming, bringing with it new technologies, new wars, and a new openness to things that had long been buried under layers of lace and shame. And still the rules persist like echoes, refusing to go quietly, finding new forms in new eras, repolished but still whispering the same message. Conform or pay. And as you stand on the edge of this epoch, having endured dinner parties, mourning rituals, fashion prisons, and the relentless moral gaze of strangers, you look back and realize the strangest rule of all was perhaps the one never written down. The rule that said you must pretend to believe in the rules, even when no one else does, and that, above all, you must never question who made them or why they benefit from your obedience, because doing so would unravel the whole charade. And maybe that's why so many Victorians seemed exhausted, not by their work or their clothes or their corsets, but by the constant soul-numbing effort of pretending, of performing, of measuring their every word, breath, and movement against a standard that was not only impossible but often invisible, shifting based on class, gender, region, and the whims of those in power. And as you take one last breath in this world of unyielding etiquette and quiet desperation, you realize that the rules were never just about order. They were about control, about keeping people in their place, about preserving a vision of society that could only survive if everyone agreed not to look too closely. And yet, despite it all, life pulsed beneath the rules' messy yearning. Beautiful life that broke through in laughter behind closed doors, in letters burned but never forgotten, in children playing when no one was watching, and even in the quiet rebellion of a mismatched button or a scandalous book tucked beneath a Bible. And it's this contrast to brittle surface and the unruly depths that makes the Victorian era so strange, so haunting, and so endlessly fascinating. And now, finally, the gas lights begin to dim, the streets grow quiet, and you feel the century slipping away, leaving only the rustle of skirts, the clatter of carriage wheels, and the distant hum of rules that no longer hold you. Not really, not anymore. So now, as we ease out of the fog-draped labyrinth of Victorian rules, you can let your breath slow and your thoughts quiet down. The clocks have ticked past the hour when whispers once filled gaslit hallways, and even the most rigid etiquette guide would concede it's time to rest. You've earned it. You've journeyed through layers of lace and smoke, through corsets and calling cards, through parlor games and secret sorrows. And maybe, just maybe, you noticed what hid between all the rules. Not just repression, but resilience. Not just silence, but stories. The human spirit, nudging at the edges of propriety, always finding little cracks in the plaster. So as the echoes of those old rules fade, imagine the lamplight softening in an upstairs window. Picture a heavy curtain drawn closed. Feel the velvet hush of the street outside. The performances have ended for the day. The scripts are tucked away in drawers. You are no longer a guest, no longer under observation. You're simply here, breathing in the stillness. Let the image blur. Let the weight of those expectations lift from your shoulders, like smoke rising into the chill night air. No more posture, no more perfect answers. Just rest, just quiet, just peace.